Well, the lights just went down, so I think that's trying to tell me something. Welcome, I'm Dr. David Anderson. I'm the Viking resident historian for this voyage. And welcome to the Star Theater for those of you that are here in the theater, and for those of you that are watching on your stateroom TV, welcome as well, and welcome to Viking Enrichment. I hope many of you had an opportunity today to see some of this wonderful area, to go to Pompeii or Herculaneum or the Amalfi Coast. It's a wonderful place, and you should hopefully you had a chance to take advantage of that. We are now steaming northward into the heart of the Mediterranean Odyssey voyage and into the heart of the Italian Renaissance. We're headed toward Rome and Tuscany. And what I want to do today, talking about the Italian Renaissance, is to introduce you to some of the most famous and influential people in world history who were part of the Italian Renaissance. I'm talking about people like Dante, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Christopher Columbus. Wait a minute. Now, some of you who are Americans might think, wait, Christopher Columbus? We didn't know he was a Renaissance man. Well, he was. He was a exact contemporary of Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And I'll get to Columbus a bit later, but I want to make that point as we get started. In history, there are few clear-cut turning points, but the Renaissance is generally labeled as the 1400s and the 1500s in Europe. And it follows the Middle Ages, which of course followed the fall of Rome in 476. And as you'll see, the term Renaissance is almost synonymous with the term humanism. And that's one reason why I'm choosing to focus in this lecture on people and distinguished and accomplished people, because that's what the Renaissance was about creativity of individual humans. But the Renaissance does come after the Middle Ages, and that term Renaissance is often thought to mean rebirth. And rebirth from what? Well, the idea was that the Middle Ages was a period of domination by the church, and that the individual human creativity was somewhat stifled or limited. And it gives the connotation that Middle Ages was some kind of dark age. That would be a mistake, because the Middle Ages were certainly rich. There were beautiful cathedrals. There were universities around those cathedrals, Bologna and Oxford. Those universities date back to the Middle Ages. But the Middle Ages were a troubled time. They were also a time of religious warfare. They were the time of the Crusades. They were the time of the Black Plague. They swept through Europe and killed half the population. So we are talking about the period that comes after all of that trouble. One other point I want to make quickly is that Italy, as we know it today, was not a unified nation at that time. So we are talking about the era of the Italian city-states. Florence, Rome, the Vatican, those were city-states. They were political entities, and they fought with each other. They competed with each other. We're talking about Venice, Genoa, Milan. Those were the Italian city-states of that era. And before we get into the Renaissance itself, I have to introduce you to three people that from the 1300s who precede the 1400s and the High Renaissance, if you want to call it that. Those three people are Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio. And here on the screen you see Petrarch, who is sometimes called the father of humanism, because it was Petrarch who began the practice of collecting Greek and Roman manuscripts, using them to challenge or some of the teachings or wisdom or practices of the church. Now, that's not to say that Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio were not religious. They were, in fact, quite religious. But what Petrarch and the others were doing was to try to combine the church with human understanding and human initiative as well. And you can see on the screen there that in the 1300s, these intellectuals developed what we now know in universities as the humanities curriculum. They developed this set of studies of rhetoric, grammar, poetry, history, moral philosophy that we now recognize as basically the humanities curriculum. And this begins in this period of the 1300s with not just Petrarch, but also with Dante and Boccaccio. Now, Dante is sometimes called the father of the Italian language because he preferred to write in his the native Tuscan dialect rather than Latin. And of course, Dante is well known for his primary work, The Divine Comedy, which is a religious journey through hell and purgatory and paradise. I think many of us today may be more familiar with Dante's Inferno from the works of Dan Brown or Tom Hanks in books and movies by the same name, The Inferno. Boccaccio's Decameron is a collection of stories. It was written to represent a collection of stories by 10 young people cloistered or hidden away in a villa trying to escape the plague. And these 7 young women and 3 young men wrote stories that were everything from erotic to tragic to funny. And the point about Boccaccio is not only was he a great writer, but they all had a message or a point about human behavior. And that was another example of how the intellectuals of the era were turning to these kind of human-centered questions. So now let's turn to the Renaissance itself. Let's turn to the movers and shakers of the Italian Renaissance. And we're going to start first with the financial movers who were behind the intellectual shakers. Humanism was not just confined to the academic elite. Florence and other Italian city-states of that era were actually quite wealthy, and their wealth came from trade in luxury items, trade in silk, trade in wool. And where there is thriving business, there is what? Banking. That's where the de Medicis come in. The de Medicis Giovanni de Medici created the de Medici Bank. And the de Medicis became the richest family in Florence and the richest family in Italy, and I don't know, maybe the richest family in Europe, but certainly they were very wealthy, and their bank was very wealthy. And Cosimo de Medici, who was the grandson of Giovanni, became a major patron and benefactor of the arts in Florence. So much of what we know today as the great art of Florence, of Renaissance Florence, was funded by Giovanni de Medici, and the de Medici Palace in Florence was built by him, and it's now fittingly an art museum. Well, as I said, the Renaissance, one hallmark of the Renaissance is the return to Greek and Roman models, the Greco-Roman art and literature. And nowhere is that really more evident than in the architecture of the Renaissance. You can see many examples of Greco-Roman influence on Renaissance architecture. Here on the screen, for example, you see the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's was built in the early 1500s, and it is modeled on Roman domes. You see throughout the architecture arches, other features that are common to Greek and Roman art. This slide also shows the classic Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian capitals on the columns. These are as much a feature of Renaissance architecture as they were of Greek and Roman architecture. And speaking of architecture, we come to two more of our big leaguers. This is Filippo Brunelleschi. He and Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti. They were both competing architects at the same time in Florence, and they did what architects do today. They submitted bids. They bid to the wealthy people in Florence for commissions to do architectural work. Well, in this case, Brunelleschi won the commission to design the dome on the cathedral in Florence. And he came up with the winning plan because there was a big problem. The floor plan of the cathedral, this large cathedral, was basically designed and actually under construction. The problem was there was a big hole in the roof, and the hole was too big for conventional architecture to cap that hole. So how do you do it? Well, Brunelleschi came up with a very creative design. He proposed to build a double dome, a dome inside a dome. And you can see from the slide, in the inset there, that what he designed was a interior dome which was an infrastructure with tension bands wrapped around it, kind of like a wine barrel, that made the strength of the structure inside, and then a decorative dome made of very light material, basic material made out of volcanic rock and so forth, a light material to make the outer dome. So this double dome construction became the solution to the problem, and of course a model which has been followed ever since by other architects. Ghiberti. Well, Ghiberti was a young man. He was only 23 years old when he won the commission in competition with Brunelleschi. He won the commission to design the doors for the baptistry in front of the cathedral. And this was a very important project because the doors were intended to be a penance, or what's the word, a thank you for survival from the plague. So this was very important to the city. He spent 47 years creating these beautiful doors on the baptistry. And it's some of the most incredible sculpture on flat surface using mathematical principles. He was able to create depth and perspective. The doors are so beautiful that when Michelangelo first saw them, he said, "I have seen the gates of paradise." And they are now known as that. They're now known as the Gates of Paradise. That's been the name they've gone by all these years. And you might notice on the screen there image of Ghiberti. Well, I said this was the human individual was important and proud of his work, and Ghiberti put his own self-portrait on the doors. That portrait is in one of the little side panels on the doors, and that was a feature that was not uncommon for artists in the sculptors and, of course, painters as well, signing their work, and not uncommon in the Renaissance. Well, get into the painting, that form of art. Before we get to the big three, and I'm sure you probably know who they are already, but before we get to the big three, I should point out that in Renaissance Italy, there was a thriving and creative amount of artwork being done all along. This is an example by Masaccio of a painting from the 1420s, which shows depth, perspective. It shows very careful attention to painting human forms. So you see that some of the great creative markers of Renaissance art were already at work in Renaissance Italy before we get to the big three. The term it says on the screen, Renaissance polymath. Well, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael were certainly what we now call a polymath. That these people were extremely accomplished and talented in multiple and diverse fields. They were artists, they were architects, they were scientists, they were writers, they were engineers. They could do it all, basically, and do it, not only will do it, but do it very, very well. And that's what a polymath is. And not only were these extremely talented, these three men lived at the same time. They lived literally contemporaries. In fact, we know, for example, for sure that Raphael and Michelangelo knew each other and worked together. They may or may not have known Leonardo, but they are all living in Italy at the same time on around 1500, a few years both sides of the year 1500. And we're going to take a look now at these three individuals. We'll start with Michelangelo. Michelangelo Buonarroti, sculptor, painter, architect. Let's start with his sculpture. He completed his two sculptural masterpieces, the David and the Pietà, before he was 30 years old. The David, or the statue of David, is the 17-foot tall statue that was for more than 300 years in the piazza, in the plaza in Florence. And now it is moved inside for safekeeping and for protection. There is a replica of the statue of David in front of the City Hall in Florence that you can see there, or you can go in the Accademia and see the original in Florence. I hope many of you will get a chance to see it. It is the statue captures the work that had begun back in the days of the Greeks and the Romans had developed, the work of capturing emotion, capturing the details of the human form. This particular pose was the moment before David threw the rock at Goliath, and there's the tension and there's the emotion in the sculpture. And the Pietà, this is carved in solid marble, and yet you feel the folds of the fabric, you feel the emotion in the image. This is life-size. This is not 17 foot tall. It's in the Vatican. These are life-size figures of Mary holding the limp, crucified Jesus on her lap. And she's portrayed as a young mother, even though she was certainly not a young mother anymore at the time he died, but it conveys her motherhood very emotionally and very effectively. This is the Sistine Chapel. If you look on the left from the outside, the Sistine Chapel is monochromatic. It's very unremarkable in many ways. It's another brick building, among others. But when you go inside the Sistine Chapel, it is one of the most incredible masterpieces, works of art ever accomplished. It's filled with frescoes. And just to remind you that fresco, of course, is painting done on wet plaster, so that when it dries, the plaster dries, the painting is part of the covering of the wall. And a number of artists painted the walls in the Sistine Chapel, but Michelangelo painted the ceiling. And the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was accomplished by Michelangelo lying on his back, working 70 feet above the floor on a scaffold. And the size, scope, and the artistry of this work makes it remarkable even before you start considering the subject matter and the detail and the interpretation and the other features of the work. It took him 4 years to complete. There are 9 scenes from Genesis. There are 300 biblical figures painted in the ceiling, and it's an example of both the significance of the church and of humanism, because the Pope Julius II, allowed Michelangelo to use a lot of artistic freedom to portray these figures in very human terms, both heroically and sometimes very, very weak and vulnerable. All the emotions, the human emotions, are in these figures, and they do celebrate the traditions of the Catholic Church. They are religious, but they are also very humanistic. You can see some of the detail here of some of the paintings. We'll go through all of these. The upper left is the creation of Adam. On the right is Adam and Eve leaving going out of the Garden of Eden. The expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. As I said, this is a brilliant execution of work, and this work was done 70 feet above the floor, with the artist lying on his back. I would mention, by the way, that Michelangelo was a young man when he did this work. I mean, he was in his 30s, I guess. But at age 74, he accepted the commission to be the architect of St. Peter's Basilica. So he had the same problem a lot of us have. He had trouble retiring. He had a long life, productive life. He worked for many years, and incredibly productive years. His work over time was not damaged. It was dulled by centuries of candle smoke, of incense, of just dirt and grime. So in the 1980s and 1990s, a project was undertaken to refurbish the Sistine Chapel. And you can see some before and after here of some of the paintings of the cleaning up. And today it's go in there, it's beautiful, it's bright, and art historians and specialists are of two minds in a way. They think, well, that's fabulous that it was restored, but is it brighter now than Michelangelo intended, or than he painted it? There's a debate about whether maybe the restorers overdid it. Maybe the work is a brighter color or not the same colors as the artist intended. But it has been renovated, and it is certainly beautiful and stunning to see it now. Let's move on to Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci, if there was a polymath, he was it. I mean, he was a scientist, an inventor. He was a painter. He combined those skills. He combined his scientific and mathematical observation with his art. You can see the sketches here on the screen that he did, human anatomy sketches, very detailed, very accurate studies of human anatomy, and he incorporated this into his artwork as well. But he didn't limit his sketches and his creativity just to human anatomy. Notice in the bottom center there's a sketch he made of a flying machine. He was a tremendous inventor and very creative on all kinds of devices, and that the idea of that it's possible to make a machine where men could fly was just one of his ideas. So Da Vinci was a Renaissance polymath. He was a Renaissance man. And so that's what we mean often by the term Renaissance man. But I'm going to submit to you that one of the most famous Renaissance people is a Renaissance woman. Meet Mona Lisa del Giocondo. You may know her as Mona Lisa. Madonna Lisa, My Lady Lisa. She was the wife of a wealthy merchant, and Leonardo painted her portrait on commission for the merchant. I think of Mona Lisa as the Taylor Swift of the Renaissance. Now, she wasn't so famous in her own time, but think about it today. Mona Lisa is a public phenomenon. Hundreds of people line up in long lines to buy tickets to see the Mona Lisa. Then they crowd into a small space side by side to just get a glimpse of her. And they work real hard to get a selfie with her. I've been in the Louvre. I've seen those crowds. It reminds me of a Taylor Swift concert. So I think, in my view, Mona Lisa is the Taylor Swift of the Italian Renaissance. Now, Leonardo da Vinci could capture a psychological moment. He used a technique called sfumato, which was a technique for a smoke-like haze in the painting that softened the eyes, softened the mouth, and that's what makes his portraits. Here's Mona Lisa. There's another one on the screen. Makes them so almost come to life and so enigmatic in this technique he used. By the way, I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek about the fame of Mona Lisa as a Renaissance woman, but there were famous Renaissance women. I would just quickly say Catherine de' Medici of the de' Medici banking family made a very good marriage. She married the King of France. Well, she married the son of the King of France, then the son became king, and then he died, and she became the Queen of France, and a very influential one. So there were influential Renaissance women in a lot of ways. Well, I don't want to move away from Leonardo da Vinci without talking a little bit about the Last Supper, because the Last Supper, certainly along with the Sistine Chapel and the Mona Lisa, are one of the most famous works of art in history. And of course, this is also the work of Leonardo da Vinci. There are, by the way, no women in this painting as far as I know, unless you follow the far-fetched plot of the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which suggests that one of these figures is a woman, but that's fiction. That's a novel. The Last Supper is a fresco. It's in Milan, and it's had an incredible survival throughout history. And it's still, you can still view it in Milan. Da Vinci, you can see his use of his mathematical insights. He very carefully crafted the painting so that it has point perspective centered just on the head of Jesus. It's a very carefully crafted piece of work, and not to mention the fine shading and the coloring and the details on the table to create the dramatic moment when Jesus said, "One of you will betray me," and all the disciples were asking, "Was it me?" And it captures the moment in a very moving and capturing way. The third of the big three is Raphael. And he, like the others, was a superstar and a polymath. I mean, he was an accomplished artist, as we will see, but he also was accepted to join with Michelangelo in designing the St. Peter's. So his architectural skills were incredible. His painting skills were incredible. Some of his greatest work, for which he's most well known, are his paintings of Madonnas. And there's several examples here on the screen of Raphael's Madonna and Child paintings. The one on the right, the Madonna and the Goldfinch, is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And if you go in the Uffizi, if you're in Florence, you may be able to see that one in the original. As I said, Raphael joined with Michelangelo in the design and decoration and artwork in the Vatican, and the patron of both, not the patron, the commissioner, I guess, the one who commissioned the work, well, the patron as well, of Michelangelo and Raphael was Pope Julius II, whose picture is there inserted in the that's also a Raphael portrait of the Pope. This painting is really interesting. Raphael was commissioned by Pope Julius to paint and decorate 4 rooms of the papal apartments, the Pope's own apartments. And on one wall in the papal is this massive, this covers the entire wall. The painting is the School of Athens. Well, think about that. This is in the Vatican, and this is a painting that celebrates the humanism of ancient Greece. In the center of the painting are Plato and Aristotle. And if you go around the room, the other figures are said to be figures of other famous, well-known Greek intellectuals, mathematicians, scientists, philosophers around the room. So the painting in the Pope's own apartments are a celebration of humanism. And as I mentioned how Ghiberti put his self-portrait in his work, well, I'm not going to try to highlight it here for you because I'm not sure I can use the tools, but on the far right side by one of the pillars was a face peeking out around the corner, and that is Raphael. He painted his own face in the side of the picture. And maybe if you do the tour, the Vatican tour, if you're in Rome, you might get a chance to see that as well. Raphael, sadly, died at age 41. He was younger than the other two, and he died at a young age. And the art world has always wondered what could this incredible genius have created if he had had a longer life, like Michelangelo had, and Da Vinci and these other artists who had lived longer lives. Of course, the artwork wasn't the only art. Music was very popular in the Renaissance Italy, and here we have homage to Monteverdi, the great composer who he lived in several cities, but he became the composer at St. Mark's in Venice. But he is one of the founders of opera, and he was one of the most famous musical minds in history. And Monteverdi is a good example of the music creativity of the Renaissance. But let's talk about this gentleman for a minute. I want to introduce you to Niccolo Machiavelli. It's said that no Renaissance book has been more widely read than The Prince by Machiavelli. And Machiavelli was a diplomat. He was a political advisor in Florence. He lost his office in a power struggle because, as I said, these were city-states. There was a lot of political upheaval, and he lost his office. He went to prison briefly in this power struggle. And the experience in prison embittered him about human nature. And when he got out, he wrote The Prince, and he wrote other books as well. And he was actually trying to get a job. He wanted to impress other political leaders of his ability as a political thinker, and which was profound, actually. He reasoned that people are selfish and ungrateful. So he asked, should the ruler be loved or feared? Considering his view of human nature, should the ruler be loved or feared? Let's do a little audience participation. How do you answer that question? Loved or feared? Yeah, I think I heard somebody say his answer was, it is much more safe to be feared than loved. He believed the ends justify the means. Now that's made Machiavelli quite controversial. Was he offering a rationale for tyranny, for the way tyrants should govern, by fear? Or was he simply starting an intellectual debate about politics? Political realism versus political idealism, which is still a debate that political scientists have today. In fact, many political scientists consider Machiavelli, like the other great intellectual minds of that era, the founder of, in this case, political science, treating politics as a study of state behavior and human behavior, and not as simply an expression of abstract values or God's will, but a study of how people really behave. In fact, he was so firm about that, not God's will, that the church banned his books. They didn't. The church was objected to his publications. Vasari, another polymath of this period, writer, artist, architect. He wrote the lives of the. I always abbreviated the lives of the artists. It's actually painters, sculptors, and architects. But Vasari's Lives of the Artists was written, and that's how we know about Da Vinci and some of the other, how some of those artists worked and how their works were created. And that was because Vasari wrote about them. He wrote a biographies of these artists. And he was not only a biographer, he was also an architect. He designed the Sari Corridor, it's called, by his name, which is the connection between the Palazzo Vecchio and the Pitti Palace in Florence over the bridge in Florence that now has the gallery in it, the Uffizi Gallery, 1,100, I think it's 1,100, over 1,000 works, paintings in that gallery, many of them self-portraits. So Vasari is a very important figure in this period as well. But I told you I would talk about Christopher Columbus. In primary school, I learned a little poem. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Maybe you learned it too. Now, think about 1492. Who was living in 1492? Da Vinci, Michelangelo. Columbus was from Genoa. Was Italian, as much a part of the Italian Renaissance as any of these other major figures. His voyage came at the height of the Italian Renaissance. Now, he sailed under the flag of Spain because the Spanish monarchy put up the money for his voyages. But he was an Italian navigator. The picture in the middle of the screen is Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo. I think Christopher Columbus wasn't a very good self-promoter. He needed an agent. Because who got his name on his new discovery? Amerigo. It's called America. Amerigo Vespucci actually sailed, he was a Florentine, he sailed to America 5 years after Columbus. And when maps were being drawn and map makers would label this new land as Amerigo's land or America, now maybe that's because Columbus thought he was in Asia when he landed there, so maybe he was a little slow on the uptake and didn't get his name on the discovery right away. But in actual fact, Columbus, Vespucci, these figures, and I think especially Columbus because he was the first, these were part of the age of discovery, of the mind, the exploring, the creativity. They were looking for new frontiers. That was what the Italian Renaissance was all about. Also on the screen is a picture of Galileo. That's from about a century later, but if you think about it, 100 years later, Galileo, like the ocean navigators, was exploring, in his case, the skies. So these were very curious and brilliant people. And, of course, Columbus didn't discover America. When he got there, there were the Amerinds, the indigenous people, and many of them had very advanced cultures and civilizations. And there had been others there before. The Norse had made a settlement in Newfoundland, the Vikings. But of course, the Norsemen, when they landed around 1000 A.D. in Newfoundland, they were not in the same mindset as the Italian Renaissance. They were still medieval. Mind wasn't open to new things. They weren't looking for new things. They were simply trading or looking for very, very commercial things. So Columbus's contribution, in my view, is to extending human understanding, is that he and his contemporaries and their voyages and their explorations, what did it do? It shifted the center of European cultural development, which had been centered on the Mediterranean. We're now shifted it more toward the Atlantic. And now we begin to talk about the Atlantic world, not just the Mediterranean or the European world. So this map, again, is a map from the 1500s, which if you studied, it's very very interesting because you can see what they knew and what they didn't know. And it's on this map that the term America is on there, not Colombia, but America. But that's the way it was for Christopher Columbus. Let's take a look now. We looked at what the Renaissance was. Let's look for just a moment at why it is important. The Italian Renaissance bridged the medieval and modern worlds. It saw extraordinary intellectual output in all kinds of human endeavors: art, sciences, humanities, from the 14th through the 16th centuries. At its core was a vital interest in humanism, a rediscovery of the writings, the teachings, the moral and ethical philosophies of the Greek and Roman world. The legacy of the Renaissance is as apparent today. As I said, it's apparent in university curriculum. It's apparent in architecture and buildings. It's apparent in governments and institutions. This rebirth of humanism, this human creativity, has become what has informed really modern life, modern science, modern politics, modern art. So what have we seen today in this tour of Renaissance Italy? First of all, the rise of humanism. So the rise of we met Petrarch, the father of humanism. It was a new age for writers and poets. We met Dante and Boccaccio. The birth of banking, the De Medicis from this period. Neoclassicism in architecture. Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, and the revival of classical architecture and moving beyond it. The explosion in painting and the arts in the big three, Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael. And invention, exploration, Machiavelli, Vasari, Columbus. This was the Italian Renaissance, which makes it one of the most productive eras in human history. We had a brief tour today of the Italian Renaissance. We are about to go in and see it in person in Rome and Florence and Pisa. And we'll see for ourselves what the Italian Renaissance is all about. Grazie. Thank you for listening. I'll be able to answer questions for you afterwards. And I hope you have a good time in Renaissance Italy. Thank you.